Labelling Museum is a project based on my wider research into the history of 19th century museums and the history of museum display and education. Museums initially left their collections largely unlabeled, assuming that people would be able to look at the object and understand it with no prompting whatsoever. This was really tactics intended to exclude people from the museum. So people without a good education couldn't really understand what they were looking at and therefore didn't come to the museum. So in the 19th century, there was a shift towards wider access and wider education. And that led to the introduction of labels. But now we're in a new period of thinking about museum inclusion and thinking about whether the labels are doing enough to make people feel welcome, not just physically in the museum, but whether their own voices, their own perspectives, and their own backgrounds are on display, are represented, and are welcomed. So that's the research that underpins Labelling Museum. And we put that into practice with a number of activities designed for some sixth form students to make them think outside the box, to make them think about how museums educate, how they display, what they display, who decides what's displayed. So today we had 4 activities, bringing in different academics from Keele from a variety of disciplines. People from the School of Medicine, School of Life Sciences, School of Law, and the School of the Humanities, looking at the collections from these different perspectives. We had students from a variety of A-level subjects, and they really were willing to think outside of their own discipline and engage with activities, for instance, creative writing, writing their own poetry, that might feel uncomfortable for someone who's just doing physics A-levels. So they were really willing to go with the activities, but I think they brought a lot of exciting new ideas to it as well. You can tell that this is a generation that is politically engaged, that does care about the issues. And so one of the tasks they were set was redesigning the Natural History Gallery to tell the story of human interventions and climate change. And they were off like a rocket. It was incredible because they care about these issues and they want to see them reflected in their local museums. They want museums to talk to them about the problems facing them today. And oftentimes historical collections look like they don't do that. They look like they talk about the past and not the now.
I think a lot of them went down kind of the more emotional route than we do. We're usually used to displaying natural science collections, particularly historically, in a very factual way. It was really interesting to see how the emotional stories came out of the descriptions and how things like climate change and habitat loss are coming to the forefront of people's minds.
I was really surprised at the level of interest and the level of thinking outside the box they were able to display, so they were able to appreciate what was the strategies that were employed, and they were also able to see why there were different objects on display, how those animals and plants on display were able to interact in that specific environment.
They had just phenomenal ideas about how we could reinterpret the collection, which I thought was really exciting and can be rolled forward into future projects I'd like to do. I'd be really interested in working with museums to do, for instance, an exhibit on the objects that have simply lost their labels. Every museum has things in the stores that they don't know what they are. And I think it would be phenomenal to bring those out for a group of students and say, well, what do you think it is? What do you want to know about this object? How could we find out? So those kinds of activities I think could really be expanded on based on the ideas the students were bouncing off each other today.
We were taking this group of completely made up animals, which is very, very freeing because that means there is instantly no right answer. And we were fitting them into the known, living and extinct tree of life. They would be constrained by the description, but I was really hoping that they'd get something in terms of what do I know, what don't I know, what else is there to be known, but with the evidence from the description itself. They responded really well to any situations in which I would give them new facts or new knowledge or a new suggestion, and they engaged with that really constructively. I think that anything which really encourages students to engage and to bring in knowledge from new fields, to bring in new ways of thinking, new ways of solving the problem, I think that's a really strong solution.
Today we've done a workshop on ivory and jade. Should they be allowed or shouldn't they be allowed? If you think about the ethics of both the way that jade and ivory is being collected, from the hunting of elephants to the miners that suffer from exploitation of their labor force. All of these issues are contemporary but also historical issues that reflect the ethics and the legality of each and every item here in the museum. I divided the students into two groups. One group was advocating for the museum's right to present jade and ivory, and another group was representing a group of activists and professors that signed a petition to ban any presentation of jade and ivory. And I was surprised how seriously the students took the task. They used the very short amount of time that they had very efficiently by building up, constructing arguments from imperialism to ethical arguments to legal arguments, looking at legal documents and journalist reports about ivory and jade, and they surprised me, and so they took much more than I expected. They all have such a rich world of ideas, and I've learned more than them, from the terminologies to their perspectives that I can even use in my own research on law and humanity and ethics. So it was a brilliant experience, really. Yeah.
I wanted to convey to the students how labels can be quite authoritarian when we enter into a museum, and that we behave in particular ways when we enter a museum. I wanted them to think, quite differently about how they might respond to an object, rather than just taking it for granted and thinking somebody else has labelled this and this is its story. I wanted to encourage them to have a diverse range of mediums, through which they might make a label. I found that they were really responsive to that. They were aware that the museum had certain cues where the museum wants you to move in particular ways and respond, in a certain manner to certain objects. Like there's ones that are more grand and ostentatious that want to be seen, and there's objects that are more smaller and out of the way. And the students were really aware of this when they were creating their labels. One really good example was a doodle that one of the students did, and then they scribbled it out and they said, oh, it was terrible. And I thought that was amazing, because imagine a label in a museum with a scribbled out doodle on there that's not really giving you much information. It'd really disrupt that relationship that we've got to objects when we're in museums. Another one was this student. He was quite underconfident with the poem that he produced, and it actually turned out to be a really good piece of work, where he'd used the coloration of the object that he'd found, and he'd used the texture of it to create a stanza of a poem that was quite skilled.
I think the real answer is definitely to rethink labels. Labels don't always strike us as useful. They have sort of basic what is it information, but not a lot else. And I think it would be really helpful to get new voices into the labels. So what does this object mean to someone who used it initially? What was its cultural significance there? What's it mean to someone from that culture looking at it now, today in Stoke? What's that experience like of, for instance, the jade collection? A visitor from Japan or China, what would that mean to them? We could put that perspective on the label. We could put the history of the object, how it came to us, on the label. Those imperial colonial practices can be recorded, and that's an important part of the story of the object. It's an important part of acknowledging the way social relations work on a global scale.
I like a short label. I like labels that are quick and easy to process, and that allow people to immediately answer what something is.
I find that individual objects are under-labelled, so I often think that I could do with a bit more. For example, the man's skull, it says man's skull. I could do with a little bit more on that. So I really find the history of the object in its original context would be better if available, rather than the history of the object since discovery, or rather than just knowing what it is. I mean, that obviously is the thing I want to know first. That's the headline. But I would like a little bit more in terms of what was it for then.
I see labeling becoming more and more political. They reflect more a wide range of views about the piece, about the history of the piece, about the creator, about the critics. And I think this is a process that is slow, but we should push towards a more diverse way of looking at exhibition items.
It's useful for a lot of the different institutions that were involved. So the students are working on independent research projects that are by nature interdisciplinary. And so the school was really excited about the way this project got them thinking about things from a number of different disciplinary perspectives, and also bridging those and thinking about how they can take this forward in their studies. For the museum, I think it was really important to demonstrate that your local museum with a kind of eclectic collection like the Potteries, which covers local history, natural history, fine art, design, military history, really can offer a unique perspective. That specialized collections, single focus collections, actually limit the way you think about them just by saying this is a natural history museum. Whereas something like the Potteries I think could be the future of museums as well, because these kinds of eclectic collections invite new voices. They invite those multiple perspectives, multiple voices that museums are really trying to get in to both their labeling practices and their audience these days. And so I think it's important to show local students that their own local museum is actually really engaged with these questions. It's not stuck in the past. It's really part of a forward push.
I'm sick of looking at bowls. Imagine if the label said that.
And from my perspective, it's really important to get students to feed into the research. So I've distributed survey questions so I can see kind of expectations that people have coming into a museum, but also how we can change it, how we can impact their use of their local organizations. We want them to come to their local museums, we want them to use these collections and to see that they are useful for a wide variety of different topics they might be studying in school or they might be interested in their lives. And that museums can be political, they can be forward-looking, they can be addressing really big problems in society today like the climate crisis, and give new ways of answering old questions.